Hello everyone, my name is Catherine Amin. I focused my project on social emotional intervention strategies for identifying and coping with emotions for secondary grade level students with disabilities. So for my educational problem, I found out what we already know. So I did some research, and according to Kern et al., students with an emotional and or behavioral disability have poor academic performance, higher levels of grade retention, lower rates of graduation, etc., compared to their peers without a disability. Kern et al. Also mentioned that adolescence is a time in which there can be an emergence of mental health concerns, as well as other issues that come about from puberty and other chemical reactions that happen when you're growing in your brain. According to Daly and McCarthy, SEL, or social emotional learning interventions, help to support young people to learn about and develop their skills to effectively manage their emotions and their interactions with others. And then according to Sheridan Smith Kim and Baritas and Park, children's learning and development are influenced by sources occurring within and across multiple systems. So not only are they being affected by things that they're learning in the classroom, but they're also learning about things at their home environment, different areas of the school environment, outside of school, etc. And then the implications of research suggest that receiving social emotional learning tactics in different areas, including school, can help the students to help cope with their strategies and help with their coping strategies and to be able to identify their emotions. What we don't know, so according to Kern et al., the extent literature base supporting these interventions that concerning social emotional in regard to students with emotional disabilities are very promising, but at the moment, a majority of the research is being conducted at the elementary level. So the need for the study would be social emotional intervention strategies for students at the secondary grade level, so middle school and high school, so 6th to 12th grade, or whatever year that these students are to exit from high school to help identify and cope with their emotions. The purpose statement. So the purpose of this study is to determine the effects of social emotional intervention strategies on students and how these intervention strategies would help the students to identify and cope with their emotions. The focus would be from using the 2015 Castle Guide, so the effective social and emotional learning programs for middle and high school education, and specifically focusing on the zones of regulation. In addition, maintenance and generalization of the skills will be assessed to ensure that students are able to take the skills they learned at school and use them in all areas of their lives. The participants are going to be secondary level students, so middle and high school students who have been diagnosed with either an emotional and or a behavioral disability. All participants will receive the direct instruction in school setting, either in a small group setting or with a one-on-one instruction. And the dependent variable is the student's ability to identify and cope with their emotions, and the independent variable is the zones of regulation. The intervention setting would be in the self-contained classroom at the secondary level in a public day school. My research questions would be, the first question was, what impacts do social emotional intervention strategies have on secondary level students with emotional and or behavioral disabilities? And the second research question was, what information suggests effectiveness of social emotional intervention strategies for secondary level students with emotional and or behavioral disabilities? So for my research design, I went with a single subject study, and I chose 5 individual students to receive direct instruction from the SEL strategy discussed, so that the zones of regulation. Each student would share their own individual experience rather than a whole group experience. So the participants would receive direct instruction over the span of 1 quarter at school, or in other words, 9 weeks, and students would receive the direct instruction in either the small group or one-on-one setting 3 times a week. Then the individual student would be pulled for a 15 to 20-minute check-in each session. During this time, the student will meet with the teacher individually, and the check-ins will alternate between students journaling their own experiences as well as viewing clips or reading passages to help students identify emotions that are present and in coping strategies that can be used to be put in place to help with the emotions. And again, this will take place over the span of 9 weeks. And the reason why I said that instruction will either be in a small group or a one-on-one setting would be to take into account any extenuating circumstances such as absences or early dismissals or anything like that that would prevent the student from receiving the instruction with the rest of the small group, but so that they would still receive that instruction, they would receive it at a one-on-one setting at a different time before the next meeting. For the participants, so again, there will be students at the secondary level, middle and high school, and the students would have been diagnosed or identified as a student with an emotional disability and or behavioral disability. These students exhibit a deficit in understanding their emotions as well as ways to cope with said emotions. There are 5 participants total, and the students were purposefully selected for the study, and they attend a public day school in which they are part of a small group self-contained emotional disability or ED classroom. Students must spend at least some of their day in the self-contained classroom. In other words, they can spend half their day in the gen ed, half their day in the self-contained, or any ratio therefore. And children who had multiple disabilities were also included in the study as long as an emotional disability or behavioral disability was one of the disabilities in the multiples. And then all other disabilities were excluded from this study. So the participants were purposefully selected, and all students were diagnosed or identified as a student with emotional disability and or behavioral disability. Convenient sampling was also used since this particular secondary school was a 6th to 12th grade school. So student participants were picked from the same school. So this is just a description of the 5 participants. So participant 1 was a 12-year-old male student who was diagnosed with an emotional disability. He also has a diagnosis of anxiety, and he can become easily agitated. And participant 2 was a 12-year-old female student diagnosed with an emotional disability as well. She prefers to be by herself and has expressed that she does not like working with other female peers. Participant 3 was a 13-year-old male student diagnosed with an emotional disability. Previous trauma from his early childhood years have affected him, and he also has a diagnosis of bipolar disorder. He prefers to work one-on-one with the teachers. And participant 4 was a 15-year-old female student who was diagnosed with multiple disabilities, an emotional disability as well as autism spectrum disorder. This student has limited verbal language and will seek out peers' triggers for a reaction. And then participant 5 is a 15-year-old male student diagnosed with an emotional disability as well as diagnosed with schizophrenia. He enjoys spending his time in the small group setting and has expressed difficulties with his general education class setting. For all 5 students, they have a current behavior intervention plan in place. So the sessions would take place in the small group self-contained classroom within the public school setting. The sessions would take place during the social skills / social emotional direct instructional block. And the generalization skills would be tested in the student's general education classroom setting, home setting, as well as any other outside settings. In the self-contained classroom, there were 5 students, 1 teacher, and 2 teacher assistants. And the general education setting would include any of the general education teachers and each of the students' classmates and their corresponding grades and classes. For the intervention and independent variable, baseline data would be collected over the course of 3 sessions. Students will be given questionnaires and rating scales before and after the intervention. For the baseline data, students would answer questions in regard to identifying emotions as well as coping strategies for their emotions. Once the baseline data is collected, the intervention strategies can be implemented. So these zones of regulation would be used as the independent variable for the study. The zones of regulation is a social emotional learning program that helps students to identify the emotions they are feeling and helps them to figure out coping strategies to help them deal with those specific emotions. Students will be taught each specific section of the zones of regulation. Students would then also learn how to keep a social emotional journal to track their emotions and coping strategies that help them with those particular emotions. Students would learn that different emotions are in different colored zones, so green, blue, yellow, and red. And students would also understand that no zone is a bad zone. Instead, it will help the students understand what coping strategy they need to use to help them cope with their emotions and to get out of that specific zone. And ideally, they want to be in the green zone, but again, no zone is a bad zone. So for generalization, it's the hope that students will be able to take what they have learned and apply it to their general education setting, home setting, as well as any other outside settings. For the measures and dependent variables, the student will be able to understand their emotions and how they are feeling. Students will be able to understand strategies to cope with those said feelings, such as taking deep breaths, talking to a person they trust, taking a break, drawing, writing, etc. They'll take what they have learned from the zones of regulation to react to any occurrences, events, situations that cause the emotions to occur in the first place. And then students will be able to use rating scales and questionnaires to measure if students are able to identify the emotion they are feeling and to identify strategies that could be used to cope with those feelings. Teacher observations and data from observations would also be collected to determine whether or not students are implementing the zones of regulation strategy. For the implementation procedures, the researcher developed data sheets that would be used to gather data through direct observations, and then data would be collected by the teacher. The teacher and the teacher assistants would implement the zones of regulation strategy in the classroom, and teachers would use the zones of regulation textbook to ensure that lessons are effective for students. After the direct instruction from the zones of regulation, students will meet one-on-one with a teacher to fill out their social emotional journals. For the intervention procedures, the intervention strategy zones of regulation will be taught to the students in a direct manner. The students would then practice implementing the strategies, and then the students would rate how they feel about one of the intervention strategies that they were introduced to. For testing procedures, students would take questionnaires and fill out rating scales before the intervention strategies are introduced to them. Then the intervention strategies will be introduced and taught to students. And then after the intervention process, the students would participate in questionnaire rating scales again to measure what has changed since the zones of regulation was introduced. For validity and reliability, content validity, which would show that the general education teachers and parents/guardians were able to provide feedback in regard to the generalization of the skills that were learned from the zones of regulation. In regard to stability, the same 5 students were given direct instruction from the zones of regulation over the course of the 9 weeks. And for internal consistency, the baseline data rating scale will be given the first day that the study starts, which would be Form A, and the post-instructional data rating scale will be given the last day of the study ends, Form B. So for the internal consistency, Form A would only be given once, and Form B would only be given once. For proposed data analysis, a visual analysis would be used for this project. Data would be collected and put onto a graph or chart. So baseline data would also be included, as well as all the data that came from after the implementation of the strategy of the zones of regulation. And then it's the hopes that data would show whether or not the student was able to identify their emotion and provide a coping strategy to help deal with that emotion in order to see how the strategy, if it helped or not. So discussion of quality indicators, conceptualization underlying the study. So research has shown that the use of the SEL or social emotional strategies is imperative in different areas of life. There is also a compelling case to conduct a study at the secondary level. In regard to participants and sampling, the participants sampling and studying were described in a way that the study can be replicated by future researchers. In regard to independent variable, the intervention strategy is one that's tangible and can be accessed by different people and therefore can be replicated by other researchers. In regard to the dependent variable focused on whether or not students are able to identify their emotions and the coping strategies that they can use to deal with these emotions. And for the data analysis technique, data would be collected throughout the process, baseline data, data during the intervention strategy, and data collected after the intervention strategy would be included in the data points. And then this is just for my mini project reflection. So the mini project helped me to break down each of the sections and helped me to give an overview of what the project was about. It helped me to organize a research study plan, and it helped me to map out a single study research plan with a focus on social emotional intervention strategies that help students identify and cope with their emotions, in this case, the zones of regulation. And it helped me to search out and examine other research and analyze other research studies in relation to this topic. And these were my references. Thank you.